I forgot. So good to bring our Sanghas together and have guests this evening. This beautiful, wild spring Sesshin, springtime. So right about now, we are deep into the woods of our koan, Nanyue's It's Not Like Something. We are also right in the middle of our Sesshin practice. And I can see that so much of the efforting in the beginning days of retreat is about creating a clearing where a certain kind of alchemy can take place. Of course, this is Zazen's action as we emerge into spaciousness, stillness, presence. And this creating a clearing is exactly the space where the koan is answered. In fact, you cannot answer a koan from any other mind. This clearing, this space is the source of wisdom. We can call it silence. The creating a clearing is not an easy task, as those on Sesshin hour after hour will attest. Of course, it is our daily Zazen activity, but in retreat, we really settle in and do some very deep cleaning. For the last couple of months at the farm here, we've been doing some very deep cleaning. After 30 years of accumulation of equipment and junk and things left from each apprentice group that comes and goes, it seems to be time. And it's thoroughly enjoyable and kind of amazing. We, over by our shop where there are a couple of open bays that has turned into fondly called the Wi-Fi lounge for our apprentices. Their couches were about 15 feet deep, and the other back 15 feet was 30 years of stuff. So we pulled out the couches, and Lisa and I rolled up our sleeves and put on our gloves and unearthed some amazing stuff. Rusted tractor parts, exercise bicycles, footstools, and things that we'd pull up and we'd say, what is this? What is this? Does this belong to anything? And we'd sort it and recycle and give away things, and it was great. And the room is cleared now, and the furniture can go back in. And then we did another room, which has been fondly named the Scary Room, which is an old canning room where we store fertilizers. And it is aptly named because I even had to suit up, but the cobwebs were hanging down from the top. And there actually were canned goods from 2012 that looked edible, but we didn't go there. Moved on. So this is the life of Sesshin, right? These first few days where we pick stuff up and encounter things, and some familiar, some unfamiliar, old regrets, odd memories, box of random fantasies, bucket of self-doubt. We hold this for a little while, day after day, moment after moment, and then let them go. And a lot of times what we encounter in Zazen and in Sesshin, we can let go. We look and we say, I don't need that right now. Not needed. Not needed. But sometimes it's not so easy. And people sometimes tell me, and I've had that experience, I just can't let this go. I just can't let this go. And I'm thinking of my teacher, my great teacher on the farm, the blackberry. And with this deep cleaning that we've been doing, I've also been hacking back at blackberries that went out of control last year because we were short-staffed and it was so crazy with the pandemic. And they popped up everywhere, and they grew up the side of the barn and greenhouses and back of the shed and into the shed. So I have been very vigilant the last 2 months with my loppers and my Felcos. And they are brutal. We have the blackberries, if you go to the base, they are so tough, and their spikes are so thin at the tip, and they're so strong. It's painful. There's just no way, even with leather gloves and a thick coat, not to get pierced. Not to get pierced. You pull one strand out and one gets you in the elbow. And sometimes all you can do is sort of hack at the tips until you can kind of get in there. But I've become pretty good at it over time. I see my pathway to the root, and I go right there. And so sometimes in Sesshin, it is also like blackberries, where something snags us and really cuts to the quick, goes under the skin, and we feel held and pierced by an old grief or despair or rage or even terror. These are also mind states, and that's when we say, I can't let go, something has me. And it's these moments that call for a more articulate response than just simply putting something in the recycling pile. Calls for the first responders. So when I meet people here in these blackberries, I say, stop, don't move. Don't move anymore. Because everyone knows if you're in blackberries and you start squirming even more, the barbs go deeper. We need help to stop and to slowly back out, to have someone help pick out the barb behind or one caught in the hair, to not be in such a hurry. The tender extracting. This is so much of our practice, clearing a space, sorting, giving away, sending on. And when it's time for blackberry practice, it's blackberry practice. Sometimes I say to someone, and it might be familiar to you, interesting, I can be curious with you here. Don't move. So in Bendua that we are reciting, it says, and I quoted this the other day, the ancestors, the people who came before us, who practiced like us, were pulled and turned in the practice of enlightenment. But the phrase I'm interested in today is the one that says these ancestors were accepted and used by enlightenment. Those who came before us made it a priority to create a clearing in the same way that we are, by any means possible. I am sure they did their share of blackberry practice. It can't be otherwise. This koan, where we are in this koan, reminds me of some of those old houses you find. Perhaps you've rented one or even owned one yourself, where you look and you're like, what's under that rug in the living room? Does anyone pull up that rug? And then you pull up the rug and discover that there's this beautiful old hardwood floor. And all it needs is a little shining up. It completely opens up the space, becomes warm and danceable. So when Nanyue comes to Huineng, and the teacher says, what is it that thus comes? Who is this before me? He's also saying to Nanyue, have you seen the floor? Have you seen and recognized the ground? In Bendua, it says, the undivided ground of non-fabrication. And do you know that it's the essence of your being? So the first time around, Huineng did not answer. He knew he didn't yet know. He hadn't yet looked under the carpet. You say the other day about Nanyue's practice with the Vinaya teacher before he came. He was unsatisfied with that practice of rules, following monastic rules, because he had not yet seen the essence. He had not yet seen the ground. But I want to emphasize that really the blame is not on the Vinaya practice. It's really how he was practicing it, what his intention was. And so he needed to shift and move and find a new venue so he could see into that. We don't know if he would have awakened had he continued with the Vinaya, because there are many brilliant teachers in that tradition, like Ajahn Chah and Ajahn Sumedho. Sometimes we can blame the practice when it's simply we haven't seen into our own intention. We haven't clarified our intention, and we think it's the practice that's at fault. But really, that's a bit of a distraction, because when we're ripe, even a stone hitting a bamboo stick is a catalyst for our awakening. So, but it's good to travel. He 8 years with his teacher, Huineng, Nanyue had. Because I also want to say it's good to have a really long stretch with someone. A long stretch with a teacher. Long enough to become disillusioned with them and a bit frustrated, so that it's a real relationship. So if you have that experience with your teacher, you're quite fortunate. It means you've entered into the real work, past the ideals, and into the clearing, the real clearing. But I want to come back to our koan with Nanyue and Huineng and pick up where I left off. And apologies for those who haven't heard the whole koan if you're just joining tonight. Hopefully some of what I say will make sense. The sixth ancestor, Huineng, challenges. We pick up where Nanyue says, I've seen into it. And Huineng says, does it depend on practice and enlightenment? Which is to say, does it depend on training? Does your awakening depend on training? Is there training and then awakening? Is what you've seen a result of your practice? Is that what you think? And what's beautiful is it's not okay to say no, which on one hand would have been a correct answer, but not full, not complete. And so Nanyue says, it's not that there's no practice in enlightenment, it's just that they cannot be defiled. They cannot be defiled. They can't be corrupted or tainted or destroyed. And I want to say two things before we even go into those phrases, because koans can really just stick us up. And I'm so glad that some of you brought the koan into Sanzen and shared how it's kind of pulled and turned you around. We can get stuck in this koan just simply with the word enlightenment. It might seem very foreign to us in our practice, depending upon where we are. So I give some other words, and I encourage you to find your own words for it. Awakening, becoming free, becoming whole and complete, living from your deepest, truest heart, coming home. Those are all words for enlightenment. When I first came to practice, one of my first, I believe it was my first retreat, I went to Kyogen, who became my teacher. And like many said, I'm really just not interested in the enlightenment thing. I'd just like to get a little calm. And I don't remember his exact words, but I'm sure they were to this point at which he said, no difference, no difference. And that didn't last that long. So an exchange like this, or what Nanyue is saying, can also seem like, well, is that my concern? That enlightenment and practice are not two? Is that really my concern? I mean, I'm just trying to find my sea legs in this Zen thing. But I want to make the case that it's all of our concern if we practice, whether we're brand new or have practiced for 30 years. And that if we realize what actually Nanyue is saying here, it promises us incredible freedom. When I first heard these lines, I don't know why. I was early in practice. I'd read this exchange. I didn't hear a talk about it. And there was something that really clicked for me immediately, even though I'm sure I didn't really understand much about practice and awakening. Something about it can't be defiled was riveting to me. And the way I describe it now, I think, was that I understood in my gut that there were larger forces at play than what I imagined I was doing, and that there was more at stake. There was more at stake than I could imagine. And for some reason, that was both exciting and freeing and a little terrifying, but it was inviting. And in many ways, that began a clearing for a space. And at that time, many of my dreams were about spaciousness, big, spacious spaces, auditoriums, cathedrals, vistas, space. When Nanyue responds to Huineng and says this, it's not that there's no practice in enlightenment, it's just they can't be defiled. We know he didn't say that from an intellectual idea. We know that Huineng saw that he understood it in the tone of his voice and his bearing. In fact, before he said it, Huineng, his teacher, would have known he knew it by watching his practice. For our edification, it is written down in an exchange, but his answer is not in the words. His answer and how he has practiced to that date is already seen and recognized. This is just a moment in time. But if we understand what he's saying, it's a radical shift. It has big implications about how we practice, because it means practice is not about failure and success, winning and losing, being better or worse, improving. Instead, there's a different source of energy for our practice. That it can't be defiled does not create a sense of whatever, anything goes, just the opposite. Just the opposite. In our practice, all of those who came before, everything that they did, every teaching, every teacher known and unknown, is all contained here in this space right now. It can't be otherwise. All the energies of all those individuals are here. In fact, if we were to chant our lineage more accurately, we would say, how would that go? The Sangha of Bodhidharma Daiyosho, the Sangha of Taisoeka Daiyosho, we would say the Sangha of. We would include all those individuals in each of those teachers as the lineage. Everyone who came before powers our practice. That's what this is saying. And there's a paradox here where if we, or when we assume complete responsibility for our own practice, it's right then that we are met by amazing help from all directions. And this is why we show great reverence for those who came before in the Zen school. We chant the lineage. We have Founders Day. We have pictures that show who came before. We have their stories and the ones we're telling now. Sometimes what's happening in the West in transition is that this is attributed somehow to Confucian China with ancestor worship, or secular Buddhism rejecting and saying this isn't needed. But actually, it's just simply intelligence to include all the ancestors, to receive and enter the power of that stream. No beginning to practice, no end to practice. No beginning or end. So what each of those greats who came before us, each of those who realized their life fully, they all learned to practice for practice sake. That's what's implied in what Nanyue is saying, to learn to practice for practice sake. Otherwise, as it says in Bendua, we would just simply quit when we had an awakening experience, right? You would graduate and you would move on. I stayed for this amount of time. I had a great opening, and then I moved on back into life. But it isn't what happens. The more openings that one has, the more diligent practice emerges in their lives. Isn't that interesting? What does that mean? The other day, I heard a program on a new thinking in biology that's apt here. And they were talking about beauty. And usually in the thinking of natural selection, everything has a utility and it's survival of the fittest. But some researchers have noticed that certain animals, like birds, peacocks for instance, certain birds that do exotic mating dances or rituals to attract a mate, have gone so far beyond the utility of that behavior that they've offered a suggestion that's quite radical in the biologist world. And that is, these animals do these things because they're beautiful, because they think they're beautiful. As a peacock, for instance, the feathers are so huge, they kind of tip the animal over. They're not so useful anymore. It's that huge. But they're suggesting that the animals actually have an interior. Now, this is pretty radical for some other biologists to say, natural selection, survival of the fittest. But I like the programs, and I'm voting for the peacocks having an affinity for beauty. And this is similar to our practice, which is that when we realize what Nanyue is pointing at, and someone asks you why you practice, it isn't to get enlightened. You can just simply answer, because it's beautiful. I practice because it's beautiful. There's no good reason, no utility, no advancing. No advancing. And your life becomes yes, yes, yes. At every turn, life becomes yes. If we see what Nanyue is seeing, then that's a radical shift. Of course, if we do that, there's still blackberry practice, whether you've practiced for a year or 30 years. The only difference is the longer you do it, you know what to do when it comes up. Here's that blackberry again. I know what to do. Stop, back out slowly. When I was battling with the blackberries, I was getting in there. Dirt all over my hands. I was not going to let these guys win. I went to pull out a big clump, and I'm really, really battling with them. And I kind of went flying and, landed in the mud with my butt. And I just looked up, and there's a beautiful blue sky right in that moment, and laughed. And sometimes the clearing comes unexpectedly in the middle of those blackberries. Our openings are not caused by our practice, Nanyue says. But my teacher would say, it does respond to our efforts. Enlightenment responds to our efforts. Not controlled by our practice, responding to our sincere effort. So when we can accept, even if we can try it on for size, that practice and enlightenment are not to always, your practice is whole and complete right in this very moment. And that we can be visited by a kind of grace when we can accept that. And we can let go of so much. No more distinguishing beginners from advanced. All fully in it right now. Under the blackberries, if anyone has some, we have many here, there is a very rich, fertile ground. Actually, because it's not walked on. So if you want some really rich soil, go under the blackberries. Leaves and berries have fallen, bird droppings. It's been completely covered and protected, often for years. No cattle. It's incredibly fertile. And of course, it's where we find the sweetest fruit. So what can we do? The doing and the practice is the creating of the clearing. Whether we've practiced for 1 year or 30, I always come back to creating the clearing. Probably why we revere sweeping in Zen. Sweeping, create the space. And so what do we do when we're in that clearing? That's a good question. I told one person at this retreat, you should wait there as if you could wait for 1,000 years. 1,000 years. This is what it means to actually be used by, the practice of enlightenment. I was thinking on the gravestone or the memorial. I don't think I want any more was greatly enlightened, or these kind of phrases we have. Not so interesting. What's more interesting is to say she was well used by the way. To be well used by the way. I'll have been satisfied if that can be said. How I was used? Well, that's not in my control. That's not my choice. To be accepted and used by the way. Everyone's invited. And it changes everything in practice when we see into this. I see people who see into this truth who are just a few years into practice, and then those who've practiced for decades who never see it. So it is not about how long we've been here, how deep our samadhi. It probably has to do with the willingness to see the truth of this and let go. Let go. Huineng knew this. Nanyue knew this. My teacher knew this. Now you know it. You are like this. I am like this. But more about that later.